Today's lesson is going to be looking at a second type of circulatory system called the lymphatic system. Keywords associated with today's lesson are lymphatic system, lymph nodes, lymphatic vessels, lymphoid tissue, intercellular fluid, macrophages, and plasma. Learning objectives for today's lesson are to explain the function of the lymphatic system and its contribution to the circulatory system and the immune response. As ever, the pages that you should be reading from your textbook are 123 to 126, and please complete booklet pages 36 to 40. So I'm just going to start off with a little reminder about fluid in the body. So we have two types of fluid surrounding the cells. We have intracellular fluid, and this is fluid that is found inside cells. Okay, so intracellular fluid is the fluid inside of cells themselves. And we also have interstitial fluid. Interstitial fluid is the fluid in between cells. So it's surrounding the cells, but it's not inside them. Okay, so when we look at blood again, we know that the main liquid constituent is plasma, and plasma contains lots of dissolved nutrients as well as water. So why are we talking about those two things? Well, if we look at this graph here, we can see that it's looking at the overall blood pressure. So if we look at that middle dotted line, that's the average pressure. We can see as we go from the aorta to the arteries to the arterioles, there's a really dramatic drop in blood pressure, and it continues to drop as we go to the capillaries, and then of course the veins and the venules have the lowest blood pressure. But what we're looking at here is this massive pressure difference from the artery into the capillaries. So what we are looking at here is the fact that the arterioles here have a higher blood pressure than the capillaries down here. So it's a difference of about 50 millimeters of pressure. What actually happens here as a result is that we have something called pressure filtration happening. And this causes the formation of a fluid that isn't quite blood to bathe the cells. And that fluid is called tissue fluid. So if we look at this image here, we can see that this is a capillary because it's one cell thick and it's only got those epithelial cells as the lining. What's actually happening here is at some point further back there was an arteriole, and it's forcing fluid through at high pressure, and the effect that that has is filtration. So some of the liquid from that plasma, from the blood plasma, forces its way through the endothelial lining, through that one cell thick lining, and the smaller molecules will pass through and the larger ones will stay inside the blood capillary. So what we're saying here is that the blood plasma is squeezed out the capillaries under that high pressure. So all of the small molecules, the dissolved nutrients such as carbon dioxide, water, ions, dissolved foods and so on, can make their way into or out of the blood capillary. Crucially, what we need to notice here is that it's only small molecules. Tissue fluid, that's the fluid that surrounds the cells, does not have plasma proteins in them because they are way too big. So by looking at this idea of pressure filtration, we can understand how molecules and materials are exchanged with cells. So we understand that living cells, a basic diagram here of a cell, is constantly producing metabolic waste such as water and carbon dioxide, and it has a constant demand for nutrients and oxygen. We also know that living tissue is surrounded by a dense network of blood capillaries, so that everything is within diffusion distance. So what's actually happening here is that useful food and ions will diffuse across or move by various forms of transport into these respiring tissues, while metabolic wastes are diffusing in the other direction. Now you have this constant medium surrounding the cells, that's the tissue fluid, which allows for exchange of nutrients, and it's a good go-between. Now, what we're going to be talking about here is how tissue fluid returns to the blood capillary network and therefore the venules and then the veins. If we look at this diagram here, what we are seeing is from an arteriole, we have pressure filtration, so we go from arteriole to capillary, and small molecules such as water and associated solutes like ions and carbon dioxide and water and glucose, they will diffuse out and the water will move out by osmosis. Then what happens is we have a high water concentration in the cell tissues, so therefore water will always move by osmosis, so we end up going from high water concentration down here into lower water concentration at the venule end. So the majority of tissue fluid will actually return to blood vessels at the venule side by osmosis. So what we tend to have is movement from high water concentration at this side here to low water concentration in the tissue fluid. This then becomes the high water concentration area, therefore water will start to return back to the bloodstream at the venule end. Okay, so now we're building up to understand what the lymphatic system has to do with all this. In this diagram here, you can see part of a lymphatic vessel. So it's a blind-ended vessel that is embedded in body tissue. So these are body cells, and this is the end of a lymphatic vessel. What you can see here in this schematic diagram, you've got the arterioles, we have capillaries, and then we have a venule on the other side. Now, in between all of this, we have the lymphatic system shown in green. The circles are showing the lymph nodes, which we'll talk about later. And we have these lymphatic capillaries, and you can see they end in those kind of blind-ended ducts as you can see here. So the lymphatic system is in fact another type of circulatory system, and it has some really important roles in the body. It helps to drain tissue fluid back into the bloodstream because you don't want your cells to be bathed in too much liquid that can make your body appear quite puffy. The idea is to filter lymph, the lymphatic system, and a really important role is to fight infections. Okay, so we have another diagram showing the lymphatic system and how it's integrated with the tissues of the body and the blood vessels also. So we now understand that from the arterial end of the blood, it turns into blood capillaries, and at that point we have high pressure filtration. So some of that blood plasma squeezes out and bathes these cells and becomes tissue fluid. That tissue fluid has to be absorbed back into the circulatory system somehow. So the first step in doing that is by the excess tissue fluid being absorbed into the lymphatic system, and that's what these black arrows are showing here. Once that tissue fluid enters the lymphatic system, we now call it lymph. So this lymph will end up being collected from from various parts of the body, and eventually that will be pushed back into the circulatory system. The fluid that moves through the lymphatic system, remembering that it's now called lymph, gets squeezed along, and it only gets pushed in one direction. You can notice that from the arrows here. And the lymphatic system also has valves in it. And remember, the function of valves is to prevent the backflow of blood. If we look at this diagram here, again, it's just showing the arterial end of blood, the capillary bed, and the venular end. So just to summarize what's going on here, we have tissue fluid surrounding cells, and that interstitial fluid, some of that will be absorbed into the lymphatic system. These black arrows are showing that. When you have that absorption of tissue fluid from the interstitial fluid moving into the lymphatic system, it's now called lymph. And in that lymphatic vessel, we can see that we have valves pushing that that lymph in one direction, the same as blood, and the valves crucially prevent any backflow. So we now know that lymph, the fluid in the lymphatic system, is mainly made of tissue fluid, which is the liquid that is filtered from blood plasma, and it collects in lymphatic vessels. In order to push this lymphatic fluid or lymph around the body, we actually rely on muscles, skeletal muscles, to squeeze and push this fluid around the body. We don't have connection to the cardiovascular system directly here, so we can't rely on the heart muscle to do that, which is why it's important that we move as humans to move this lymph around the body. The lymph will eventually be pumped up from various parts of the body to lymphatic ducts, which are found under the clavicles or the collarbones here and here, and that fluid will then drain back into the bloodstream. Okay, so associated with the lymphatic system, we have lymph vessels and also lymph nodes. Now, lymph nodes look like this here. They're bean-shaped organs between 1 and 25 millimeters long, and they are surrounded by a mesh of connective tissue. The connective tissue that you can see here inside the lymphatic inside the lymphatic nodes, are really important in producing a framework. Now, inside these nodes, there are various leukocytes or white blood cells. Specifically, we find lymphocytes here, which make antibodies, and macrophages and plasma cells. Now, the lymphocytes and the plasma cells are important in antibody production, as I've mentioned, and the macrophages are involved in phagocytosis. So that is that process of cell eating. So often we refer to macrophages as phagocytes because they carry out phagocytosis. So if we look at the function of lymph nodes and their importance in the immune response, what happens, and you can see in this diagram here, that the lymph that we've collected from the body enters through these vessels to the node. So what's happening is we have a convex side, which means it's wider as it enters and narrows as it goes through, and this allows for filtration through the node itself. The reason why we need that filtration is because large particles such as bacterium will get trapped in this fibrous mesh, and this will prevent them from filtering and circulating around the body. As we've noted in the previous slide, there are macrophages present in the nodes. Therefore, when they recognize some of this trapped and filtered debris from bacterium, they will engulf it and destroy it through phagocytosis or cell eating. The lymphocytes, another type of leukocyte, remember, are also part of the immune response, and they are associated with the manufacture of antibodies. These are also found in the nodes. So when you are ill, when you have an infection or a virus, you will tend to find that the nodes will swell, and this is simply your body's response to manufacturing more lymphocytes to help fight your infection. Just a summary of the function of the node. The lymph fluid that you've collected from the body will filter through these ducts into that fibrous mesh network inside the node. Any bacterium and debris will be trapped in here. Macrophages will then start to destroy it through phagocytosis. You also have lymphocytes in here, which are the precursor cells to make antibodies. Once that lymphatic fluid has been cleaned, it will then be pushed out from the node through lymphatic vessels, which will then connect to the circulatory system and be drained into blood. Here we can see the lymph nodes of someone who's quite unwell, and you can see it's quite enlarged. Often what will happen when you're unwell is that a doctor will feel underneath your jawline to see if your lymph nodes are swelling. This is an indicator that you are fighting infection and your white blood cell numbers are increasing. This diagram here shows the location of other lymph nodes in your body. You have some at the groin area, on your underarms, round about the breast tissue area, and of course at your neck. This is a really good summary video of the lymphatic system. I'd really encourage you to watch that for an overview, but that is the end of the lesson. Please make sure that you do read those pages in your textbook and you do have a firm understanding of the lymphatic system, and make sure that you complete the pages in your booklet. Thanks for watching.